Mist gathers over Duncairn Hall as a carriage stops at the gates, and a ruined lady steps down to serve in the house that once would have welcomed her as a guest. Inside, portraits watch, fires whisper, and the air trembles with a secret long buried. On her first night, a familiar voice cuts the silence, a profile in the corridor. A heartbeat she thought she'd forgotten. Is this fate's cruel echo, or the past demanding to be answered? Between duty and desire, between pride and forgiveness, a single choice will change everything. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from. And one more thing. What do you love most about historical romances? The longing, the scandal, or the redemption? Edinburgh, Scotland, January of the year 1885. A veil of pale fog clung to the hills as Glenda Fairchild stepped down from the black carriage onto the frozen gravel drive of Duncairn Hall. The wind cut low and cruel across the moors, carrying the scent of pine and coal smoke, and whispering through the frost-bitten hedgerows that lined the estate's gates. In the stillness of the morning, the house rose before her, sombre, vast, and unwelcoming. Built of grey stone and memory, it loomed like a relic clinging to its own past, every shuttered window a silence waiting to be broken. She drew her woolen cloak tighter across her chest and adjusted the modest bonnet that framed her face. Her gloved hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of returning to a world that once cast her out. Beneath the cloak, her dress was plain, dark brown wool, high-collared, starched cuffs pressed without flaw. It bore no ornament, but spoke of order, modesty, and a woman who no longer expected to be seen. A figure emerged from the arched doorway, descending the stone steps with a gait of quiet authority. Mrs. Fraser, the senior maid, was a woman carved from discipline and long winters. Her hair, streaked with grey, was tucked beneath a linen cap, and the keys at her hip clinked softly with each step. Her eyes, sharp and appraising, swept over Glenda's form in a single, thorough glance. "Miss Fairchild, I presume," she said, not unkindly, but without invitation. "Mrs. Fraser," Glenda replied, her voice even, her chin lifted with quiet pride. No further pleasantries were exchanged. The two women entered the grand hall together, their footsteps echoing against marble floors and vaulted ceilings. Inside, the chill persisted, despite the lit hearths, and the air smelled faintly of dust and lavender soap. Portraits of long-deceased Kincraigs watched from the walls, their expressions frozen in oil and forgotten glory. Mrs. Fraser led her through a narrow passage toward the housekeeper's quarters. The room was small but tidy, its single window frosted at the corners. On the writing desk rested a ledger, an inventory incomplete, and beside it a key ring waiting for her hand. "Lady Glenmuir's orders were specific," Mrs. Fraser said. "You're to remain discreet, firm, and silent where needed. The staff's unsettled since the Countess passed. The house runs on memory more than routine. The Earl has not interfered." Glenda inclined her head. "I understand." But understanding did little to calm the storm within her chest. Once alone, she removed her gloves and laid them on the bed. Her fingers, raw from travel and tightly clasped nerves, moved toward the pocket of her cloak. She withdrew a small satin ribbon, scorched faintly at one edge, a relic from another life. She stared at it a long moment before tucking it inside the drawer of the nightstand. There would be no need for sentiment here. Later that evening, as twilight bathed the stone walls in a melancholic glow, Glenda descended to the kitchens. She walked the estate as one might walk a forgotten cathedral, eyes tracing every neglected corner, every crooked picture frame, every whisper of absence. She spoke little, but the maids noticed her steady presence. She righted a lopsided candlestick without a word. She reorganized the dry stores. She returned a misplaced book to the library, brushing dust from the leather spine like one brushing ash from a grave. The silence of Duncairn was nearly sacred, but it was not complete. Just past the gallery, in a corridor she did not expect to cross, she heard it. A voice, low, measured, male. It was speaking to someone unseen, a stable hand perhaps, but it froze Glenda in place as if her body remembered what her mind would not allow. That tone, that cadence, a note of warmth hidden beneath command. She turned, breath caught, and for a single moment, only one, she saw him. He passed beneath the arch at the far end of the hall, head slightly bowed, wrapped in a dark wool coat. The firelight from the sconces caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the familiar furrow of his brow, the brush of silver at his temple. She knew that profile better than she knew her own reflection. Ewan Kincraig, the man who vanished from her life without a word. The man she had once vowed to marry. The man whose silence had become the cornerstone of her ruin. Glenda's breath escaped her in a shudder she could not control. She stepped back into the shadows, hand pressed to her chest, as if to steady the ache that bloomed there. He did not see her. He did not stop. And yet the space between them hummed with a memory that refused to die. When he disappeared around the corner, the silence returned, but it was no longer sacred. It was haunted. And Glenda knew, deep in the marrow of her bones, that whatever peace she had come to seek in this place would not be found. Not now. Not with him here. Not with the past walking these halls in flesh and bone. The first days at Duncairn Hall passed beneath a low winter sky, the kind that seemed to press down upon the world with a quiet, unrelenting weight. Snow threatened, but did not fall. The air was damp, heavy with the promise of cold, and the hearths burned low in every wing, struggling against the draughts that crept beneath ancient doors and window panes older than memory. Glenda Fairchild moved through the great house like a whisper of order, never hurried, never idle. She rose at 5:30 each morning, lit her own fire with steady hands, and walked the narrow servants' hall with her keys at her waist, her woolen skirts brushing softly against the stone floor. She spoke in tones as measured as the ticking of the long case clock in the gallery. She gave no cause for suspicion, offered no sliver of her past to be dissected by gossiping tongues. And yet she listened, she learned, she watched. The Earl of Rothvale, her Ewan, appeared only in passing, a figure of elegance carved in distance. He seldom descended before noon and took his breakfast alone in the study. He walked the estate grounds with a collie by his side, eyes lowered beneath the brim of a dark Homburg. The servants said he was grieving still, that he had grown colder since the death of his wife. Glenda neither confirmed nor denied their murmurs. She simply pressed linen, signed the butcher's orders, and arranged the house with the grace of a woman who had once commanded drawing rooms, now far beyond her reach. But her soul was not quiet. Every time she heard his voice, her chest tightened with a memory she dared not summon. When he entered a room, she kept her eyes cast downward, and yet she felt him, each step, each breath, as if the house itself had never stopped echoing his presence. It was a torment as exquisite as it was cruel. He was alive, and she was in his service, and he did not know her. He had not recognized her. The realization did not wound her pride, it annihilated it. Once, he had memorized every angle of her face, traced her fingers with his own, vowed to cross continents for the promise of her hand. Now, he passed her in the corridor with no more thought than one might give a chair or a pane of glass. Time and disgrace had done their work well. And yet, she did not retreat. Glenda had known humiliation, but she would not know shame again. She held her head high, her back straight, and when summoned to the Earl's study to discuss the ordering of new linens for the guest rooms, she entered with composure, nodded respectfully, and stood with her hands folded before her like a lady awaiting instruction. He looked up from his ledger as she entered, and something flickered across his expression, not recognition, but something quieter, more uncertain. "Miss Fairchild," he said, rising with the elegance of habit. "You're efficient. Mrs. Fraser speaks highly of your work." She inclined her head. "Thank you, my lord." His study was warm, lined with leather-bound volumes and framed maps of Rothvale's holdings. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, catching in the dust motes that danced like ghosts around them. He gestured for her to approach the desk. "I understand the guest wing has fallen into disuse," he said, his tone clipped but not unkind. "We may be receiving visitors next month. I would appreciate an assessment." "Of course, my lord," she replied. "I will prepare a full report before the week's end." He looked at her then, truly looked, and his brow furrowed slightly, as if something beneath the surface of her voice or bearing had unsettled a memory long dormant. "You're English, aren't you?" he asked, more curious than accusatory. She met his gaze, unflinching. "Yes, from Surrey." "Surrey," he repeated, as if testing the word against old echoes. "Not many from that part find themselves north of the border in January. There are fewer invitations," she said softly, "and fewer eyes." He tilted his head slightly as if to question her meaning, but she offered nothing more. He nodded once and returned to his seat, dismissing her with a flicker of thought. "That will be all, Miss Fairchild." She curtsied and turned to go, the sound of her boots muffled against the wool carpet, but as she reached the threshold, his voice followed her. "Have we met before?" She stopped. Her pulse quickened. There it was, a question like a flame, fragile but real. She turned her head just enough for him to see her profile. "No, my lord," she said evenly, though her heart pounded with the lie. "I don't believe so." And she walked away before he could see the truth in her eyes. That evening, long after the bells had tolled 9 and the house had settled into its creaking silence, Glenda sat alone in her room. The fire in the grate had dwindled to coals, and the only light came from the oil lamp on her writing desk. Her hands, still raw from hours spent scrubbing the brass banisters, reached for a small wooden box tucked beneath her bed. She placed it on the table with reverence. Inside were only 2 things, a folded letter and a ribbon, yellowed and frayed. The letter bore her handwriting. Unsent, unopened, she had written it 10 years prior, after waiting for months with no word, no explanation. It was full of pleading and confusion, the final cry of a woman not yet broken. She read the first line aloud, her voice shaking. "My dearest Ewan, I write not to beg, but to understand." She folded it again, slower this time, and held it over the flame of the lamp. It caught instantly. The parchment curled, blackened, and vanished in her palm. When it was gone, she opened the satin pouch that held the ribbon, pale blue, singed at one end. He had tied it around her wrist the night they first spoke of marriage, beneath the rowan trees near Ashby Manor. She had worn it every day for a year, even after he vanished, even after the whispers started, even after her name became a stain no one dared speak aloud. Now she placed it carefully in the drawer beside her bed, not to hide it, but to keep it near. It was no longer a symbol of promise, it was simply hers. Across the house in his study, Ewan stood before the fire, staring into the flames as if they might speak. He could not shake the way the housekeeper had looked at him. Calm, yes. Dignified, but there had been something in her voice. Something in the way she did not flinch under his gaze. He had spoken to countless servants, countless women, and yet that one moment in the doorway lingered like a line of music he could not place. He poured a measure of scotch into a crystal tumbler and did not drink it. Instead, he moved to his writing desk and opened an old drawer long untouched. Inside, an envelope yellowed with age lay beneath a bundle of dried herbs. He did not open it. He simply stared at the handwriting. Her handwriting, Glenda. He had buried her name for nearly a decade, convinced himself it was better not to remember, better not to reopen the wound of her disappearance, of the silence that came when he needed her most. He told himself it could not be her, and yet something in the stillness of the corridor whispered otherwise. Something in the way she said, "Fewer eyes," the ribbon, the letter, the fire, the silence. Memories stirred like ash in the hearth, and the man behind the shadows felt the weight of recognition draw near. The third week of January descended upon Duncairn Hall, wrapped in a grey hush, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. The days remained dim, lit only by the anemic winter sun that filtered through lace curtains and clouded glass. The air inside the manor had taken on a peculiar stillness, not of peace, but of quiet scrutiny, like the pause before the pull of a curtain. Glenda Fairchild walked the house with purpose, her steps soundless but precise, her keys swinging gently at her side like a chapel bell muffled in cloth. Each morning she traced the same path, from the scullery to the servants' quarters, past the stairwell that led to the private wing, and through the long eastern corridor where a cluster of unused guest rooms lay dormant beneath layers of dust and disuse. It was there, amid the forgotten silence, that she first noticed it. A draught where there should be none. A faint odour, ink perhaps, or something scorched, lingering just behind the wainscoting near the estate office. She paused, hand resting on the doorframe, listening. No footsteps, no voices, only the soft creaking of wood settling in the cold. Inside the office, the light was weak. The curtains had been pulled halfway, and the fire had burned low. She moved toward the desk, massive, carved oak, and opened the ledger left atop it. The last entry was dated 3 months earlier, in a neat, masculine script that did not match the handwriting of the current steward, a young man far too disorganized to be responsible for such precise account-keeping. Curious. She turned the page back. A notation marked an order of coal, double the usual amount, listed under a vendor she did not recognize. She flipped to another page. A duplicate invoice. A discrepancy. She straightened slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. Her eyes moved to the drawer beneath the ink blotter, one she had tried days before and found locked. Now it slid open without resistance. Inside were neatly arranged stacks of parchment, some official, others informal. Among them, one envelope was half charred at the edges. She lifted it carefully, the fragile paper threatening to crumble at her touch. The seal had long since melted away, but part of a signature remained visible. R.S., the initials of the former steward. Dismissed quietly the year before, with no public explanation. Beneath the envelope, a note in the same hand. The ink smudged as if once wet with rain or tears. Glenda read only one line before folding it again, her pulse rising in her throat. The ledger must be corrected before her ladyship returns. Her ladyship. Lady Glenmuir. Glenda slipped the documents back into the drawer, her breath catching as she pressed the drawer shut. She would not alert the staff. Not yet. Not until she understood what the papers meant, but something in her spine stiffened, something old and familiar. A sense that what had ruined her once had begun here, not in the ballrooms of London, but in the shadows of places just like this, halls where truth was locked away with tarnished silver. Later that evening, she took tea in the servants' hall. The other staff spoke of ordinary things. Coal rations, a child's illness in the village, the way the third bell on the drawing-room wall now rang twice for no reason. Mrs. Fraser sat opposite her, darning a pair of gloves with military efficiency, her eyes flicking up now and then with unspoken questions. "You've a mind for numbers," Mrs. Fraser said at last, not looking up from her stitching. Glenda set down her cup. "My father taught me to balance the household accounts by the time I was 12. He believed a woman should know how to manage what the world might one day take from her." Mrs. Fraser's needle paused. "And did it?" Glenda smiled faintly, her expression unreadable. Eventually, there was a silence then, not awkward, but weighted. "I hear you were once known," Mrs. Fraser said quietly, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. Glenda did not flinch. "I was. Infamous, some say." Glenda lifted her chin. "Yes." The old maid's hands stilled. "Are you dangerous?" "No," Glenda replied, "just inconvenient." Mrs. Fraser studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod and returned to her sewing. That was all. No more was said. But Glenda knew she had passed a kind of test, one measured not by confession, but by composure. That night, as the wind howled across the eaves and rain tapped at the leaded windows, Ewan Kincraig stood at the top of the west staircase and watched Glenda from the shadows. He had not meant to. He had come looking for silence, for solitude. Instead, he had found her walking the gallery with a candle in hand, inspecting the row of paintings that lined the wall. She wore a grey dress buttoned to the throat, her cloak folded neatly over one arm. Her hair, drawn back in its usual chignon, had begun to loosen in tendrils that curled at her nape. She was not beautiful, not in the way society demanded, but there was a dignity to her, a clarity of form and movement that made him pause. The way she held the candle with both hands, steady and reverent, reminded him of a woman kneeling in prayer. She stopped before a portrait, one of his mother, and tilted her head as if listening to a voice that no longer spoke. Ewan stepped forward without thinking. Most skipped that one. She turned slowly, her features illuminated in the warm flicker of light. She did not startle. She met his gaze with quiet resolve. "She has a kind face," Glenda said. "She had a strong one," he replied, stepping beside her. The scent of lavender water lingered faintly around her, a trace of gentility buried beneath the starch of her station. "She ran this house better than any man, including me. You don't run it poorly." He looked at her then, truly looked, and something deep in his chest stirred. "Do you always walk the halls at this hour?" "I walk them when they speak," she said simply. He raised a brow. "And what do they say?" She glanced at the portrait. "They remember, even when others forget." The words unsettled him more than he could admit. He watched her a moment longer, then said, "You move through this place as if you belong to it." Her eyes flickered, just for an instant. "I don't," she replied. "But I know what it is to be forgotten." He felt the words in his throat before he understood them. "I haven't forgotten you." The silence stretched. She tilted her head. "Then I am not who you think I am." And with a small nod, she turned and walked away, the candlelight trailing behind her like a ribbon of flame. Ewan remained motionless in the corridor, the flickering glow of her presence fading around the corner. There was something about her, something that pressed against the edges of his memory like a book left open too long. He did not know her name, but he knew her absence. And the house, for the first time in years, felt like it was preparing to speak. The morning Honoria Boyd arrived at Duncairn Hall, the skies turned the colour of tarnished silver, and a hush fell over the house like a silk sheet over a wound. It had been some years since anyone of political importance had crossed the threshold of Rothvale's ancestral seat, and even longer since such a guest arrived with her own intentions stitched so plainly into her gloves. Honoria descended from her lacquered carriage like a queen dressed for inspection. Her gown was a masterpiece of London's most daring tailor, dove grey silk taffeta with a bustled skirt layered over crisp underskirts that rustled with every step. A matching hat, trimmed in black feathers and wired netting, perched at an angle on her perfect golden curls. Her chin tilted upward, her gaze sweeping the entryway before settling, almost leisurely, on Glenda. The housekeeper stood at the base of the staircase, flanked by two maids and Mrs. Fraser. Glenda's attire was as precise as ever. Dark woolen dress, linen apron freshly pressed, bonnet removed. But she felt the weight of Honoria's gaze pierce deeper than fabric. It was not the look of a woman greeting her staff. It was the look of a predator taking measure of another's silence. "How quaint," Honoria murmured, offering her gloves to a footman. "I see Rothvale has retained a taste for modest efficiency." Glenda lowered her eyes only for a heartbeat. "Welcome to Duncairn Hall, Miss Boyd," she said, her voice steady. "Your rooms are ready." "Oh, I have no doubt they are." Honoria's smile did not reach her eyes. The following hours unfurled with theatrical grace. Honoria swept through the drawing rooms, trailed by attendants and suggestions. She commented on the arrangement of fresh flowers, too humble. She disapproved of the tea service, too provincial. She insisted the music room be reopened, though no guest had played its piano since the late Countess passed. And she treated the staff, particularly Glenda, with the patronizing charm of a woman who had never met a servant she could not replace. By the time the formal dinner arrived that evening, the entire household was taut with tension. The table had been set with the estate's finest china, polished silver glinting under chandeliers lit with gaslight and crystal. A roaring fire bathed the panelled walls in amber, and the scent of roasted venison mingled with rosemary and wine. Glenda stood silently near the sideboard, overseeing every detail with the poise of a woman trained to anticipate disaster before it strikes. Ewan entered late. His coat was dark green velvet, a deep hue that reminded Glenda of moss beneath rain. He wore it unbuttoned over a black waistcoat, his white cravat starched, his expression unreadable. When he entered the room, conversation stilled for a breath. Honoria stood, allowing herself to be kissed on the hand. "You're as elusive as ever," she said, voice bright as cut glass. "I've had much to occupy me," Ewan replied, glancing once, just once, toward Glenda. Their eyes met for the briefest moment before his gaze moved on. The dinner began with civility. Honoria told a story about a reception in Belgravia and laughed at her own wit. Ewan responded with polite nods, sipping his wine more than he usually did. Other guests, two distant cousins and a parliamentary aide, offered comments about rising tariffs, failing rail lines, and the unfortunate deaths of mutual acquaintances. It was only during the second course, just as Glenda signalled a footman to pour more claret, that Honoria leaned slightly forward and with a seemingly careless smile said, "Do you recall, Ewan, that ball at the Marquis of Fenlay's? The one where that poor girl, what was her name, caused such a stir." "Ah, yes, the debutante who disgraced herself with some minor nobleman in the garden. London whispered about it for weeks. Such a tragedy. Her name escapes me now." Silence. A fork paused mid-air. A chair creaked. Ewan's gaze sharpened as he set down his glass. "I recall many events from that season," he said carefully, "some more worthy of remembrance than others." "Of course," Honoria said lightly, her eyes sliding toward Glenda, who remained still at the edge of the room, hands folded, breath shallow. Her face had gone pale, not from shock, but from recognition, from understanding exactly how deliberately that story had been chosen. Honoria's voice was no accident. She knew, or suspected. Glenda's hands trembled, only slightly, just enough for Ewan to see. His jaw tightened. The rest of the meal passed in brittle civility. Conversation resumed, albeit more cautiously. Honoria directed her wit elsewhere, but the stain of her remark lingered like spilled wine on a white glove. After dinner, Glenda slipped away from the main hall and into the corridor beyond the west wing. Her footsteps echoed on the stone floor, her breath shaking as she reached the quiet space outside the morning room, where shadows pooled like secrets. She pressed her hand against the cool paneling, trying to steady the thrum in her chest. He had not defended her, but how could he? He did not even know it was her. "Miss Fairchild!" His voice came from behind her, and she turned slowly, finding him closer than expected. He stood without pretense, his posture tense, one hand at his side, clenched into a loose fist. "You're upset," he said. She held his gaze, her expression composed but tired. "There was nothing improper about the dinner, my lord. Don't lie to me." The words were not cruel, they were quiet, raw. Glenda's lips parted, but no explanation came. Only silence. Ewan stepped closer, his voice lower. She was speaking of someone she expected you to remember. Glenda did not blink. "Many scandals occur in London, my lord, and how many of them make you turn white as linen?" She inhaled sharply but remained still. "Some wounds fade, some don't." He looked at her as if through fog, through memory, searching. "I asked you once if we had met. You said no." "I did. Was that the truth?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to say his name not as my lord, but as Ewan. She wanted to drag the truth out from the grave where it had slept, to hand him the pain, the betrayal, the years lost in silence. But pride, harder than stone, rose like a wall between them. "No," she said finally. "You were mistaken." His breath caught just once before he stepped back. "Very well." He left without another word. Glenda leaned against the wall, her hands trembling again, but not from fear, from doubt. Because in that moment, she did not know if she had told him the truth or if she had just told herself another lie. And far away in the silence of her room, folded into the drawer of her nightstand, the scorched ribbon waited, waiting for the moment her pride would finally loosen its grip. The last breath of January crept across the grounds of Duncairn Hall like a reluctant ghost, brushing frost against the window panes and filling the chimneys with a wind that moaned low and long. Inside, the great house whispered in wood and shadow. The lamps flickered, fires popped, secrets stirred. Glenda Fairchild stood alone in the storage room beyond the old butler's pantry, a space rarely entered by anyone since the late Countess's passing. The air was stale with age and disuse, filled with the scent of dried lavender, coal dust and thyme. Dust clung to every surface. The light from her lamp cast a trembling golden halo around her, warming the edges of forgotten furniture draped in white linen. She had come in search of unused silver trays at Honoria Boyd's imperious request, but her gaze had fallen upon a battered tea chest shoved beneath a warped sideboard. Something about it made her stop, not its appearance. It was plain oak, unremarkable, but its placement. It had been hidden with intent. She knelt before it. The lock was broken, rusted clean through. The hinges creaked in protest as she pried it open. Inside lay a handful of bundled cloth napkins, a torn ledger, a silver spoon dark with tarnish, and at the bottom, bound with a faded blue ribbon, a thick sheaf of letters. Her breath caught. She reached for them slowly, as if afraid they might vanish. The parchment was yellowed, but the ink remained clear. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the top page. Her name was written at the top. Not her title, not her family name. Glenda. The handwriting was his, unmistakable, bold, elegant, and familiar as breath. She read, "I do not understand your silence. Every day I wait, certain you will write, certain there is some reason for your absence. I fear something has happened. If you are ill or worse, I shall not forgive myself. Please, if this reaches you, tell me what I have done. I cannot sleep. I cannot rest. I walk the edges of Rothvale and feel nothing without your voice in the world." Her knees gave beneath her. She sank to the floor, the letters cradled in her lap. There were dozens, some dated weeks apart, others only days. Some were long, desperate, and nearly incoherent with longing. Others were restrained, almost formal, but no less aching. He had written of confusion, of fear, of love, of betrayal. "Did you ever care for me at all? I keep thinking of your hands, the way you used to tuck your hair behind your ear when you were nervous. I see you in everything, and still you will not answer me. Please, I cannot bear this silence." Each word sliced through her with delicate precision. 1,000 questions she had buried now rose like cinders in her throat. All these years, she had believed he had abandoned her, forgotten her, let her name be dragged through the filth of society's whispers without defense. But these letters, they were proof that he had tried, and someone had stopped them. At the bottom of the bundle, beneath the last folded page, she found a set of receipts. Her breath stilled. They were invoices for courier services. Each bore a familiar signature, R.S. Rufus Statham, the former steward of Duncairn Hall, dismissed quietly the year following the scandal. Glenda had heard his name only in passing, noted with the same tone one might use for spoiled milk or a rotten beam. She examined the last invoice more closely. It had been countersigned, not by the steward, but by someone else. A name she had seen only recently on the calling card left by Honoria Boyd's brother when he visited last summer. Her hand clutched the edge of the tea chest. This was no accident. This was betrayal, crafted deliberately. Letters intercepted, lies constructed, a silence enforced. They had stolen his words from her and hers from him, and the price had been her ruin. She did not remember rising. She did not remember leaving the storage room or walking the narrow halls with her fists clenched and the papers pressed to her chest. All she knew was that her breath trembled and her body ached with a grief so deep it felt like drowning. It was Mrs. Fraser who found her near the back staircase, leaning against the wall, the letters clutched in her hands. "My word," the older woman whispered, rushing forward. "Are you hurt?" Glenda looked at her, her eyes hollow with disbelief. She offered the letters without a word. Mrs. Fraser took them gently, skimming the first page. Her face paled. "Good Lord," she murmured, then glanced back at Glenda with something like sorrow. "He wrote to you all this time?" "Yes." "And you never knew?" "No." Mrs. Fraser was silent a moment, then looked down the corridor as if checking for footsteps. "You must show him." "I can't," Glenda said, her voice thin, raw. "Not yet. He's so far from who he was. And I've become someone else entirely." "Don't be foolish," Mrs. Fraser snapped softly. "That man is still inside him. I see it when he looks at you." Glenda shook her head. "He doesn't know me. He will." The letters trembled in Mrs. Fraser's hands. She returned them to Glenda slowly. "If you walk away now, you'll carry this wound forever. Stay, just long enough to decide what truth deserves to be told." That night, Glenda did not sleep. She sat at her writing desk, the lamp burning low, the letters spread out like cards of fate. She did not read them again. She knew them now, by heart. At 11:30, the first murmur of voices rose from the front hall. Footmen, laughter, and then came the sound that stopped her breath. Glasses clinking, applause, polite, expectant gasps. She stood. From her window, she saw the last of the guests exiting into the snowy night, their cloaks drawn, their expressions amused. The house was buzzing. By morning, the news had spread like wildfire. Honoria Boyd had made an announcement. She was engaged to the Earl of Rothvale. No ring, no formal confirmation. Only a few carefully chosen words spoken at the foot of the grand staircase, within earshot of the right ears. "We expect to make the announcement official soon," she had said, her arm brushing Ewan's sleeve. "But we are keeping it quiet for now, for the sake of propriety. Of course you understand." And then she smiled. Glenda, standing in the servants' corridor, had heard the whispers firsthand. They slithered through the household like smoke, doubtful, amused, anticipatory. No one quite believed it, but no one dared question it either. Not aloud. Glenda said nothing. She returned to her room and locked the door. She lit a candle, and beside the scorched ribbon in her drawer, she placed the topmost letter, the one written on a stormy night years ago, with trembling hands and ink-stained fingers. The one that began not with apology, but with grief. "My dearest Glenda." It had never reached her then, but now it might. The snow began just after dusk, falling with a silence so complete that it erased the very sound of the world. By 7 o'clock, Duncairn Hall was a fortress of whiteness, its windows shrouded in frost, its chimneys groaning under the weight of wind and frozen soot. It was not the soft, storybook snow of children's verses. This was a storm born from the north, wild and unforgiving, sweeping across the moors like a judgment long delayed. Glenda Fairchild had just finished checking the scullery fires when the first gust rattled the kitchen doors. The lamps flickered. One went out. She glanced upward, instinctively listening, not just with her ears, but with the tense, practiced stillness of a woman who had learned to read the language of buildings. Something was wrong. There was a tightness in the air, a thickness that spoke of smoke, not steam. She turned swiftly, following the faintest whiff of burning toward the drawing-room corridor. A bitter, acrid scent was seeping beneath the door of the small parlour, a room rarely used in recent months, but lit earlier for warmth. She pressed her hand to the doorknob. It was hot. Without pause, she opened it. The room was dim, thick with smoke. The hearth, meant to be a gentle comfort against the storm, had turned rebellious. The chimney flue, likely choked with snow and soot, had failed, sending a slow, sinister cloud into the chamber, and in the centre of it all, standing before the fire with one hand gripping the mantel as though to steady himself, was Ewan Kincraig. He turned sharply as she entered. "Leave. Now. It's not safe." But Glenda had already moved across the room, her skirts trailing ash. "You shouldn't be here. I might say the same to you." She reached the windows, opened one with effort, despite the wind that fought her, dragging a breath of frozen air into the room. The smoke resisted, curling like a serpent around their ankles. He approached her. She didn't retreat. "Why are you always where I least expect you?" he asked, voice low, strained. She looked up at him, her face smudged faintly with soot, her hands red from the cold. "Because I never truly left." The words escaped before she could stop them. He stilled. "What did you say?" She shook her head, trying to step past him, but he caught her wrist, gently but firmly. "No more riddles, Miss Fairchild. No more evasions. Tell me what it is you're hiding." She did not answer. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire hissed, smoke huffing angrily from the hearth like a wounded beast. And then, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, she said it. "Ewan." He froze. The grip on her wrist loosened. "What did you call me?" She looked up, eyes shining with tears not yet shed. "Your name. Because it's yours. Because I know it better than I know my own." He stared at her, breathless, and something inside him shattered. He reached for her shoulders, not in anger, but in disbelief. "You, Glenda." Her nod was slow, tormented. He stepped back as if struck, his jaw tense, his chest rising with a breath that did not steady him. "You were here all this time, and you let me believe you were a stranger." "I had no choice," she whispered. "I didn't come here to find you. I came because there was nowhere else." He turned away, pacing to the fire, raking a hand through his hair. "You let me look at you like a stranger. You let me speak to you like a servant." "Now what would you have done?" she asked, voice rising. "If I had told you my name the first day, you were a man made of ice, Ewan. I didn't know if you even remembered me, much less if you would care." He turned sharply. "I wrote to you. I begged you for answers. And I never received a single word," she snapped. "Not one." A long silence fell between them, filled only by the whisper of wind and the occasional crack of the fire. Then slowly, Glenda reached into her apron pocket. She drew out a folded sheet of parchment, faded, worn, and placed it on the table. Ewan looked at it, then at her. "There are more," she said. "Dozens, all yours, all hidden. I found them in a locked chest beneath the pantry stairs." He crossed the room with hesitant steps, picked up the letter and unfolded it. His eyes scanned the page, the handwriting he recognized as his own. He read the first line, then another, and then the third, until his hands trembled, until his shoulders sagged with the weight of what he had believed for years. "You never saw them," he whispered. "No." He dropped the letter, staggered back, and pressed a hand to his brow. "I thought you'd left me," he said hoarsely. "I thought you'd vanished without a word. They made it seem so. Someone at Duncairn, your steward, and Honoria's brother." He looked up, stunned. "I have the receipts. His name is signed." His lips parted in disbelief, the layers of betrayal catching in his throat like thorns. "All this time," he murmured. "All this time I hated you for a silence you never chose." She stepped closer. "I hated you for a silence I thought you did," she whispered. "I thought you'd turned away when I needed you most." He shook his head, furious and broken all at once. "You were ruined, and I believed it. I believed you'd sold yourself, and I hated myself for still loving you." The words cut, but she didn't flinch. The air between them crackled, not just with smoke or heat, but with a lifetime of unshed tears, of words swallowed, of wounds left to rot beneath the skin. She reached into her other pocket and pulled out the ribbon, the one he had tied around her wrist beneath the rowan trees so many years ago. The ends were singed, the color faded. He saw it and staggered back. "You kept it," he breathed. She nodded. "Even when I hated you, even when I wanted to forget." He stepped toward her haltingly. "I don't know what to do with this," he said. "I feel like the world shifted beneath me." "We begin again," she said softly. "Or we don't. But we stop living inside the lies other people built." Outside, the storm raged. Inside, something else cracked open. Not anger, not regret, but recognition. When he reached for her this time, it wasn't with desperation, but reverence. He touched her face just once, his fingertips brushing the edge of her cheekbone, as if to confirm she was real. And then he let her go. "I need to speak to Honoria," he said, turning toward the door. "You'll break the engagement." "There was never an engagement," he replied. "Only a trap." And with that, he left the room, the smoke swirling behind him like a veil lifted at last. The snow that had cloaked Duncairn Hall in silence had begun to thaw by the second morning of February. Icicles wept at the corners of the great eaves, and the scent of damp earth returned to the wind like the first stirrings of breath after a long illness. But with the melting came a different kind of danger, one that crept not from nature, but from the rot buried within the walls of the house itself. Glenda Fairchild had not slept since the storm and the firelight confession that changed the very shape of her past. Her nights had become a fragile mosaic of flickering memories and wary resolve. She had not spoken to Ewan since he left the parlour with his jaw tight and his eyes bright with understanding. The storm had passed, but its echo remained lodged somewhere deep in her ribs. She rose early that morning, as always, the keys at her waist clinking softly as she moved through the lower halls. A list of tasks sat folded in her apron pocket, but her mind was elsewhere, on the letters now locked safely in her room, on the ribbon whose faded blue still carried the scent of smoke and a long-dead promise, and on Ewan's eyes when he realized the truth. It was nearly 7 o'clock when Mrs. Fraser found her near the stairwell leading to the east wing. "Miss Fairchild," the older woman said, breathless, her cheeks ruddy with alarm. "There's something wrong in the estate office." Glenda turned instantly, following her down the corridor. A thick smell hung in the air, burnt paper, scorched wood. She knew that scent now too well. When she pushed open the office door, the sight stopped her breath. Smoke still curled faintly from the hearth, but it was not the chimney that had betrayed them this time. The wooden desk had been torn open, its drawers ransacked. Piles of paper smouldered in the center of the rug, blackened scraps fluttering in the low draught like dying moths. Ash coated the floor, the walls, even the frame of the window that had been left ajar, an escape route hastily used. She crossed the room in 2 strides, dropping to her knees before the half-burned remains. "The ledgers," she whispered. "The letters." She reached for what remained, but the heat still clung to the core. She recoiled, clutching her fingers. Mrs. Fraser knelt beside her. "I'll fetch Lord Rothvale." "No," Glenda said quickly. "Tell him to bring water and gloves. Heavy ones." Within moments, Ewan appeared, his coat thrown over a waistcoat, no cravat, hair still damp from washing. He said nothing as he surveyed the destruction, but his eyes flared with fury. Without hesitation, he removed his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and dropped to the floor beside Glenda. "Stand back," he told her. "I won't," she answered, reaching for a nearby pewter tray. "You need 2 hands. I'll take what you pass." Their movements were swift but cautious. With iron tongs and gloved hands, they lifted the hot remains of documents and dropped them onto the tray. Some were lost, charred beyond recognition, but others had survived, edges blackened, words still visible in streaks of ink. Then came the cry, "Here!" Ewan said, wincing as he pulled a bundle from beneath the desk. These were wedged behind the leg. It was the second ledger, one of the older ones. The pages were singed, the corners crumbling, but the center was intact. Glenda opened it carefully. Inside were entries, dates, invoices, lists of deliveries, and a column of payments signed not by the steward, but by another hand. One she recognized, Honoria's brother. She felt her stomach twist. Ewan looked at her, his jaw rigid. His right hand was blistered where the glove had failed. She reached for it instinctively, holding his fingers gently in her palm. "You're burned." "I don't care." "You should." Their eyes met, his shadowed with pain, hers shining with gratitude she had no words for. Together they rose from the ash. Later that afternoon, the steward was found in the stables, attempting to bribe a young groom into hitching a carriage before dusk. He was cornered by Ewan and two of the estate's tenants, men loyal not only to the name Rothvale, but to the housekeeper who had quietly restored dignity to their forgotten home. Faced with the burned evidence, the preserved ledgers, and Ewan's cold fury, the steward cracked. He confessed everything, the courier receipts, the intercepted letters, the bribes from Honoria's brother to delay Glenda's departure once she had arrived, to keep her from speaking, from being seen. "I was paid to watch," he said, "paid to keep her invisible." Ewan did not speak during the confession. He only turned and walked away once the man finished, as though even acknowledgement would soil him. By evening, Glenda stood before Lady Glenmuir in the drawing-room. The matriarch sat like a statue carved from frost and stone, her expression impassive, the folds of her morning gown perfectly arranged across her lap. Glenda handed over the ledger and the burnt fragment of one of Ewan's letters. "I have no title, my lady," she said, her voice calm. "No dowry, no family name that holds weight. But I brought truth into this house, and what was taken from me, my voice, my dignity, my past, I have retrieved." Lady Glenmuir opened the ledger without looking at Glenda. Her fingers moved slowly, turning page after page, reading the signatures, the dates, the entries. She closed the book and looked up. "You uncovered what none of my solicitors could." "I uncovered what no one thought worth finding," Glenda replied. Silence stretched between them. "You will remain at Duncairn," Lady Glenmuir said at last. "I make no promises of approval or favour, but I do not dismiss what has been done. That is all I ask." As Glenda turned to leave, Lady Glenmuir's voice called her back. "He was a different man before you were taken from him." Glenda paused at the threshold. "So was I." The door closed softly behind her. That night, the air in Duncairn Hall was different. Not lighter, not freer, but cleaner. The weight of deception had been lifted, if only slightly, replaced by the slow pulse of truth. Smoke still clung faintly to the walls, but it no longer smelled of ruin. It smelled of something else, of beginning. Ewan stood at the window of his study, his hand bandaged, his breath fogging the glass. Glenda walked past in the corridor below. She didn't see him, but he watched her. For the first time in years, she was not running, and neither was he. Winter had not yet released its grip on Edinburgh, though the nights had softened into something less cruel. The skies hung heavy with clouds the colour of slate, and the wind that rolled down from the hills still tasted of ice and memory. Yet within the walls of Duncairn Hall, preparations stirred like breath in a long sleeping body. For the first time in nearly 3 years, the great chandeliers of the ballroom were to be lit. Musicians had been summoned from the city. Footmen scrubbed marble floors until they shone like frozen rivers. Servants polished every banister, dusted every cornice, and pressed linen with the reverence of ritual. Word had spread far beyond the estate. Rothvale would open its doors once more. Lady Glenmuir had made the decision herself, not for joy, not even for triumph, but to reassert what dignity remained after weeks of whispered scandal and shattered illusions. The Boyd family's grip on respectability had begun to loosen, and though the matriarch never uttered their name aloud, her decision to host the winter ball was as much an act of strategy as it was of legacy. The invitations were written in her own hand. They bore no mention of engagements, no acknowledgments of broken courtships or revived affections. Only a date, a time, and the elegant seal of Rothvale. The guest list, however, spoke volumes. Every family of consequence within 3 counties was summoned. Editors, members of parliament, widows with fortunes, daughters with dowries, the curious and the cunning alike. By dusk, the carriages lined the long drive, their lanterns cutting through the mist like beacons on a dark sea. Inside, the ballroom glowed. Candles flickered in silver sconces. The chandelier above, newly cleaned, cast a kaleidoscope of light onto the polished floor. Music floated from the far end of the room, the strings of the quartet trembling with anticipation. Glenda stood in the doorway to the servants' hall, watching as the first guests arrived. Her dress was deep burgundy, a shade chosen not to impress, but to endure. It had been one of the late Countess's gowns, altered with care by the estate's seamstress, and though its fabric bore the weight of years, it fit Glenda with a grace that startled even herself. Her hair, usually bound in strict formality, had been coaxed into soft waves and pinned with a single pearl comb. She had no jewelry. She needed none. Mrs. Fraser, passing behind her with a tray of champagne flutes, paused. "You look like you belong," she said. "I don't," Glenda replied. "You do now." The music swelled. The room filled. Ewan entered not long after. He wore black, no embroidery, no gold trim, a simple tailored coat, a white cravat, gloves folded beneath one arm. His expression was unreadable, his gaze scanning the room as if cataloguing each guest with precision. Honoria Boyd arrived just behind him. She wore a gown of silver silk, heavily beaded, with a diamond tiara that caught every light in the room. She moved like a woman on the brink of something, either conquest or collapse, and she smiled with teeth too white, too deliberate. She swept across the floor, trailing gasps and admiration, her arm outstretched. But Ewan did not take her hand. Instead, he turned and crossed the room toward Glenda. Every head turned, every voice fell. She saw him coming and stood straighter, her breath steady, her spine like iron beneath the weight of every watching eye. He stopped before her, his voice low. "May I have this dance?" She looked at him. The silence behind them deepened. She could see Lady Glenmuir in the far corner, her posture still, her fan unmoving. Honoria stood frozen, a half-laugh caught in her throat. Glenda took a single breath and nodded. The orchestra, sensing the shift in atmosphere, swelled into the first strains of a waltz. Ewan led her onto the floor with the ease of a man who had once memorized every line of her body. His hand settled at her waist, their fingers intertwined, the room blurred. As they began to move, the whispers began. "Is that the housekeeper?" Surely not, but she was involved in that scandal in London, was she not? I thought she was ruined. Isn't she the one who exposed the steward? The music soared. Ewan did not take his eyes off her. "You're shaking," he murmured. "So is the room. You don't have to stay." "I do." His gaze softened. "You don't have to say yes tonight." "I wasn't planning to." He smiled then, just enough to soften the sternness that clung to him like shadow. They spun once, twice, and on the third turn, Glenda saw the columnist from the Edinburgh Gazette standing near the edge of the dance floor. He was older than she remembered, rounder in the middle, his once black hair now streaked with grey, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He held a notebook in one hand, and in the other, a single white card. Later, he approached her with a bow more sincere than she expected. "Miss Fairchild," he said, voice gravelly, "I owe you an apology." She raised an eyebrow. "I wrote the article that broke you." She said nothing. "I believed what I was paid to believe. I no longer do." Still, she was silent. "I want to print a retraction, a full one, not a correction, a confession." Her eyes narrowed. "Why now?" Because the story is no longer about scandal, he said. It's about survival and justice and truth. That sells better. She gave a tight smile. Then I accept on one condition. Name it. You print every name involved, every lie, every signature. You tell it all. He hesitated. She didn't. Or you print nothing. He bowed again, deeper this time. As you wish. The ballroom pulsed around her as he disappeared into the crowd. Ewan approached once more, his expression guarded. I saw him speak to you. She nodded. He'll print the truth. And after that, she looked up at him. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small box, simple, velvet-wrapped. She held up her hand before he could open it. Not tonight. His brow furrowed. Glenda, I've reclaimed my name, she said softly. But I haven't reclaimed myself. Not yet. He lowered the box. I don't need a title, she continued. Not to be whole, not to belong. I never needed you to carry one. I know, she whispered, but I need to choose. For me. He stepped closer. And if I wait, then you'll be the first man who ever did. He smiled and bowed. The music played on. And in the shadows beyond the ballroom, where secrets had once flourished, truth now bloomed like a winter rose, unexpected, delicate, and real. The first thaw came not with sunlight, but with the quiet hush of dripping icicles along the eaves. Snow still clung to the hedgerows like a final breath of winter, but in the softened soil beneath the rose garden, life stirred unseen. The winds that once screamed through the chimneys of Duncairn Hall now carried the scent of damp earth and moss. It was not yet spring, but the promise of it lingered in the air like a vow. Inside the manor, change unfolded with equal subtlety. Gone was the frigid stillness that had gripped the house for years. Fires were lit in rooms long closed, curtains were drawn back in the morning, allowing sunlight to kiss the time-worn tapestries. The ticking of clocks, once silent, now marked the hours again, and in the corridors the staff walked with purpose instead of fear. Ewan Kincraig no longer retreated into shadow. He had not become a different man. His voice still held the clipped reserve of a lord, burdened by responsibility, but his silences were no longer empty. They listened now, rather than punished. His footsteps echoed not only in the study but also across the fields. He visited tenants whose roofs sagged under the weight of years. He stood in barns and kitchens, speaking plainly, taking notes, sometimes without his coat, sleeves rolled to his forearms. The villagers began to say he had returned, not from war, but from grief. He sold unentailed parcels of land, defying his grandmother's warnings of disgrace. Let them whisper, he had told Glenda. I'd rather lose a patch of soil than the men who work it. And when the money came, it did not go to horses or mahogany, but to seed, repairs, wages. The estate, once frozen in silence, now exhaled slowly back into life. He moved his office from the dark-panelled study to the sun-filled nursery wing. The change puzzled Lady Glenmuir, who viewed sentiment with suspicion but said nothing. There, among faded murals of sailing ships and toy soldiers, Ewan arranged his ledgers. He wrote letters beside the painted fireplace, its chipped blue tiles warmed again. He did not speak of what had once been lost there, only nodded when Glenda entered and made space for her at the desk. She no longer wore the apron. The housekeeper's keys had been passed discreetly to Mrs. Fraser weeks before. Glenda's presence remained unspoken yet absolute. She walked the halls as if they remembered her steps. In the afternoons, she gathered the tenants' children in the west parlour, where the windows let in the sun, and dust motes danced in the golden light. She read aloud, Dickens, Tennyson, even parts of the Odyssey, pausing to explain words, letting them ask questions with sticky fingers and wide eyes. She had asked Ewan if she might open the old library again. He had only raised a brow and handed her the ring of brass keys. With the help of Mrs. Fraser and 2 footmen, she sorted the shelves, cleared the ash from the hearth, and reopened the library doors. The room had the scent of old paper and lavender oil. She labelled each spine, stitched new cloth bookmarks, and began to lend volumes to the families of Rothvale. What had once been a room for lords became a sanctuary for learning. And yet, despite the slow blooming peace, there remained an invisible distance between her and the world upstairs. Until one rainy afternoon, when Lady Glenmuir requested Glenda's presence for tea. The invitation arrived on a silver tray, handwritten on the Countess's personal stationery. No flourish, no pretense, simply tea, 4 o'clock, drawing room. Glenda hesitated before the carved door. Her reflection wavered in the polished knob, and her heart thudded like a warning. She had stood in this room once, as a girl of 18, trembling beneath her first coiffed chignon, clutching a fan she didn't know how to use. Now she wore no powder, no perfume. Her gown was plain blue wool, the cuffs neatly pressed. She knocked once. "Enter," came the reply, crisp as frost. Lady Glenmuir sat by the hearth, her posture impeccable, her cane resting across her knees. Her hair, once raven black, had surrendered to silver, and her eyes, still sharp as blades, studied Glenda not with disdain, but something older, older than judgment, older than pride. "Miss Fairchild," she said, motioning to the seat across from her. Glenda curtsied without flourish and took her place. The teapot steamed between them, and for several minutes neither spoke. The crackling fire, the rain against the windows, the soft clink of china, these were the only voices in the room. "I watched you with the children," Lady Glenmuir said at last. "You know how to quiet them without frightening them. That is rare." Glenda's fingers rested lightly on her teacup. "They deserve to feel safe, my lady." The older woman nodded once. "And the library. I received a letter from Mrs. Alden, praising your choice of reading for her son. He no longer hides under the table at church, apparently." Glenda allowed a faint smile. "I'm glad to hear it." Lady Glenmuir sipped her tea, then set the cup down with precise care. From a small box on the side table, she withdrew a square parcel wrapped in violet velvet. She held it, not as one might offer a gift, but as one might return a sword. "This belonged to my late husband's mother," she said. "It is not worth much to anyone but a kin Craig." She extended the box. Glenda did not move. "Take it." Glenda accepted the parcel and opened it slowly. Nestled within the velvet was a ring, delicate, gold, with a single sapphire set between twin pearls. The metal was warm from Lady Glenmuir's hand. "I do not offer apologies," the matriarch said, "nor do I pretend to understand what passed between you and my grandson 10 years ago, but this family has endured many things, deaths, debt, disgrace, never with such grace as you have shown. That deserves something." Glenda's throat tightened. She closed the box gently. "Thank you," she whispered. Lady Glenmuir looked toward the rain-blurred window. "Do not mistake silence for disapproval, Miss Fairchild. Sometimes silence is all we have left when pride has said too much." They parted without ceremony. As Glenda walked the corridor, the box pressed to her chest. She heard the music of the house change. Doors opened, the clock chimed, someone laughed downstairs. The echo of life. Outside, the snow had melted into streams that traced the curves of the land. Children splashed in muddy boots. Green shoots pierced the wet earth, and in the highest tower, where wind once howled through broken panes, a curtain was drawn back to let in the light. Duncairn Hall was awakening, and Glenda, for the first time in years, no longer felt like she was trespassing inside her own story. The first true day of spring dawned with a quiet certainty. No dramatic bloom of flowers, no riotous colour. Just the steady, silken warmth of the sun as it slipped through the mist and kissed the hills of Rothvale, as if brushing the forehead of a sleeping child. The earth smelled new again, of grass, of tilled soil, of something forgiven. The garden behind Duncairn Hall had been left fallow for years. Briars had claimed the stone paths, and weeds had crept into the once proud rows of roses. Yet beneath the neglect, the bones of beauty endured. Moss-covered statuary, a cracked fountain that still caught the morning light in its shallow basin, and an arbor where vines had once danced in summer. It was there, beneath the arch of twisted ivy and memory, that Ewan waited. He had dressed without help, though it had taken longer than he'd admit. His left hand still ached from the burns, the skin now rough and red like truth exposed to light. He wore a dark blue waistcoat, the same one scorched during the fire, now carefully repaired by Fraser's steady hands. Inside its lining, sewn by Glenda herself, lay the charred fragment of a ribbon, the very one he had tied around her wrist all those years ago, beneath a canopy of stars and promises. He ran a hand through his hair, once groomed with rigid precision, now softer, brushed back, but unruly at the edges. He looked not like a nobleman posing for a portrait, but like a man who had learned to live again, with soil under his nails, wind in his lungs, and ache in his heart. A bird called from a nearby branch. The breeze carried the faint scent of lilac from a bush just beginning to bloom, and then she came. No music announced her, no guests turned their heads to admire. Only the hush of nature, the breath of the land, and the sound of footsteps on old stone. Glenda walked toward him with quiet purpose. Her dress was simple muslin the color of soft cream, with a high collar trimmed in hand-stitched lace. No corset, no jewels. Her hair was swept into a low chignon, unadorned save for the same ribbon, the original one, faded and clean, woven gently through the coil like a secret. She did not carry flowers. She did not smile. She looked at him as one might look at the sea, reverently, with caution and longing in equal measure. "Glenda," he said, his voice low, barely touching the wind between them. She stopped just short of him. Her hands remained at her sides, but her eyes searched his face as if gathering the years one by one, folding them into understanding. "You came," he added, though he had not truly doubted she would. Still, the words held awe. "I never left," she replied softly. He reached into his waistcoat and drew out the scorched ribbon, now trimmed and stitched at one end, the fabric fragile but whole. He held it between them. "This," he said, "was never a promise I stopped keeping. I just didn't know where to take it." Glenda's eyes welled, but no tears fell. "Not today. You gave it to a girl," she whispered, "and I'm not that girl anymore." Ewan nodded. "No, she burned away, and what remains is a woman I trust with everything I have left." He stepped closer, slowly, letting the silence between them settle like dust in sunlight. "I've burned for years," he said, his voice low, unpolished. "Now I want to build something, not what we lost, something new, something ours." The air trembled between them. The ribbon fluttered in his fingers. Glenda took it, not because she had to, not because the world demanded it, but because she could, because she wanted to. She looked down at the fragile piece of silk in her hands, then up at the man who had waited, too long perhaps, but who had never truly let go. "Yes," she said. They said nothing more. The ceremony, if one could call it that, took place under the arbor as the sun climbed above the clouds. There were no hymns, no string quartets. Only the household stood nearby, Mrs. Fraser in her best black coat with a handkerchief neatly folded, the footman with polished boots and uncertain expressions, the cook who had cried unabashedly when Glenda had passed through the kitchen that morning. Lady Glenmuir stood slightly apart, her cane planted firmly in the grass, her face inscrutable save for the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth when the vows were spoken. She did not offer a speech, but when the blessing was given, she stepped forward, placed a gloved hand on Glenda's shoulder, and gave a single deliberate nod. It was more than Glenda had ever hoped for. It was enough. When the bells rang from the chapel on the other side of the valley, their chimes were gentle, not triumphant, as if honoring not conquest but quiet endurance. Glenda and Ewan walked the path back toward the house together. The same path where she had once arrived, with frost clinging to her hem and shame heavy in her chest. Now she walked it not as a servant, not as a fallen lady seeking refuge, but as herself, Glenda Fairchild, the woman who had survived the fire, the silence, the betrayal, and her own sorrow. Ewan's hand clasped hers, warm and sure. Behind them, the house stood tall and bright, its windows reflecting sky instead of shadows. The ivy on the east wing had begun to bloom again, small green leaves unfurling like promises spoken at last. Inside, the library waited, its shelves full and its hearth warm. The schoolroom held books and chalk and laughter. The garden would need tending. There would be muddy boots, repairs, disagreements over ledgers, new seasons of both harvest and heartache. But they would be shared, and as Duncairn breathed again, its halls echoing not with loss but with life, Glenda knew that some things, once broken, could be remade, not into what they once were, but into something braver, something chosen, something eternal. And she was not afraid. The year was 1891, and the world, it seemed, had begun to tilt forward. Railways now reached corners of Scotland that once knew only the echo of hooves. Young girls attended school with books in their satchels, not just dreams. The estate system, once unshakable, showed cracks beneath its marble. Old names no longer held the power they once did, and whispered revolutions began in parlours instead of streets. But at Duncairn Hall, the rhythm of the earth remained. The gardens, once choked with brambles, bloomed in radiant symmetry. Children's laughter drifted from the schoolhouse behind the orchard. The library smelled of parchment and rosemary. And in the west wing, behind tall windows that caught every drop of sunset, Glenda sat with a journal on her lap, and ink-stained fingers curled around a cooling cup of tea. Her hair was streaked now with threads of silver, but it suited her, like the patina on old silver, earned and proud. Her figure had softened, as had her voice, though neither had lost their fire. She still walked the estate grounds every morning, still carried her keys, even though she no longer needed to. Habit, she called it. Stewardship, said the tenants. Loyalty, whispered the staff. The ring on her finger, the one from Lady Glenmuir's velvet box, never left her hand. Ewan was late returning that day. He had taken the cart into the village to meet with the school board, now expanded under Glenda's tireless vision. He had grumbled, as always, about meetings and signatures and wool-stuffed bureaucrats who never dirtied their boots, but he had gone. He always did. They had learned in these 6 years how to weather more than storms, how to argue without breaking, to grieve without retreat, to love in the quiet places that life allowed. Their home had become a refuge for orphans, for teachers, for widows of the harsh winters that came in those years. Not all who came stayed, but those who stayed never left unchanged. Lady Glenmuir had passed 2 winters ago, with a Bible in one hand and a letter from Glenda in the other. Her funeral had drawn nobles and farmers alike, for she had ruled the land with iron, then with grace. In her will, she left Glenda not only a sapphire brooch, but a seat on the local council of landowners, an unthinkable act just a decade earlier. Some protested, most nodded. None dared defy the will of a woman who had changed in the end. Honoria Boyd, once the bane of Glenda's peace, had vanished from society with the weight of scandal. Her brother, shamed and indebted, fled to the continent and died in obscurity. The retraction Glenda secured in the press became legend, a tale of fallen debutantes who rise again, not through vengeance, but through truth. Young women clipped the article and saved it in drawers. One had even written Glenda a letter, saying it gave her courage to walk into her own ruined engagement with her head high. Glenda had written back. The sun dipped lower now, brushing golden streaks across the marble floor. A soft creak of wheels echoed in the courtyard, and she rose instinctively, crossing to the window. There he was. Ewan still limped slightly from an old riding injury, but his shoulders were broad and sure as ever. He wore a hat too small for his thickening hair and a coat too thin for his pride. He carried a parcel under one arm, and when he saw her watching, he lifted it and smiled. They no longer needed words for such moments. Glenda met him at the door, and he pressed the parcel into her hands. Inside, nestled in tissue and twine, lay a new ribbon, silk, blue as the sky they once watched together on their last night before the world fell apart. The same color as the first. She looked up at him, and he simply said, "It was time." Later that night, the household gathered in the kitchen for tea and music. The cook's daughter played fiddle. The twins from the stable sang out of tune. Ewan told a story about a rooster who'd stolen his glove, and Glenda laughed so hard she spilled her tea. It wasn't a grand life by London's measure, but it was full. And when the house had gone still and Glenda stood by the nursery window, where their daughter now slept, breathing softly against the embroidered pillow, she closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of warm stone, of parchment and tea and new lilac. She had once feared that love, once shattered, could never truly mend. But now, years later, she understood. Some loves do not mend. They become something stronger. They become home. Some stories stay with us not because of grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but because of the quiet, persistent courage it takes to choose love again, after betrayal, after silence, after time. Glenda's journey reminds us that even the most broken paths can lead us home. That what once was lost may not return in the same shape, but it can return with greater strength, deeper grace, and the kind of beauty that only life and pain can carve. Perhaps, like Glenda, you've carried wounds in silence. Or like Ewan, you've lived with questions unanswered. But through forgiveness, truth, and the quiet bravery of choosing again, healing is always possible. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Share what moment moved you the most, or simply write the word grace so we know you stayed with us until the very end. It means more than you know. If you'd like to support the team that brings these timeless romances to life, you can now send a super thanks here on YouTube in any amount your heart feels moved to give. Your generosity helps us keep creating stories filled with love, hope, and meaning. And if you're not able to support us financially, we understand completely. Just sharing this video with a friend or loved one helps more than you realize. And before you go, don't miss the other unforgettable love stories we've carefully prepared for you. They're linked right here in the cards above. Each one is a window into another world, another heart, another chance. Thank you for walking this path with Glenda and Ewan. May you carry their strength and their grace into your own life. We'll see you in the next story.